You've said it, or you've wanted to say it. People have equal rights, but they don't have a right to equal outcomes. And somewhere in the middle of saying it, you felt it slip. The other person looked at you like you just said something cruel, and you didn't have the next sentence. Maybe it was at the dinner table with your adult children. Maybe it was at work, where the framing has shifted so completely that even the question feels dangerous to ask out loud. Maybe it was just in your own head, replaying the conversation you didn't have because you couldn't find the words in time. That feeling of knowing something is true and not being able to say why is one of the most specific frustrations of this political moment. And it's worth naming before we go anywhere else. It is not ignorance. You are not missing the point. You are missing the sentence that completes the argument. Edmund Burke wrote that sentence 235 years ago. Most people who quote him today have no idea what it actually says. This video is going to change that. We're going to read the full passage, not the soundbite, the full thing. And by the end, you're going to understand not just why Burke drew the distinction, but why his version of it is more powerful, more honest, and more demanding than anything you'll hear on cable news or in a philosophy class. And yes, I said more demanding. That part is going to surprise you. Here's the problem with the phrase as it circulates now. You'll find it in op-eds, in speeches, in the comment sections of conservative publications. Politicians have used it. It shows up on social media, under thumbnails of the Founding Fathers. It gets treated as a finishing move, a checkmate that ends the argument about equality the moment it's deployed. And in almost every single case, the person citing it quotes only the last 8 words. Not to equal things, which is fine, those 8 words are true. But 8 words without context are not an argument. They are a signal, a tribal marker that tells the other person which team you're on. And signals don't persuade anyone who wasn't already persuaded. They just sharpen the lines. Burke was doing something else entirely. To understand what, you need the full passage. In Reflections on the Revolution in France, published in 1790, Burke wrote this: "Whatever each man can separately do without trespassing upon others, he has a right to do for himself, and he has a right to a fair portion of all which society with all its combinations of skill and force can do in his favor. In this partnership, all men have equal rights, but not to equal things." Read that slowly. There are 3 ideas in those 2 sentences, not 1. The first, every man has the right to act freely within his own domain, without coercion. That is a right of liberty. The second, every man has a right to a fair portion of what society, with all its skill and force, can do in his favor. That is a right of participation in the common good. Not a guarantee of equal outcomes, but an entitlement to be treated as a full member of the partnership. The third, and this is the pivot on which the whole argument turns, the partnership is real, but the shares within it are not equal. They are proportional. The word Burke used was partnership. Not a crowd, not an aggregate of individuals, a partnership. And in any serious partnership, membership is equal, but contribution and return are not. A firm with 3 partners does not divide the profits by formula regardless of who did the work. That would not be fairness. That would be the dissolution of the incentive that makes the partnership worth joining in the first place. Burke was making a philosophical argument about the structure of civil society, not a policy argument about tax rates. The distinction matters. To understand why he was making it then, you need to know what he was arguing against. In November 1789, a dissenting minister named Richard Price stood in a London meeting house and delivered a sermon called A Discourse on the Love of Our Country. Price had just witnessed the early stages of the French Revolution, and he was exhilarated. He told his congregation that the French people had asserted their natural rights, their right to choose their own governors, to cashier them for misconduct, to frame government for themselves. He believed the revolution was the dawn of a new age of liberty, an age in which abstract reason would finally displace the accumulated weight of custom, tradition, and inherited privilege. Burke read the sermon and was horrified. Not because he opposed liberty. He had spent decades defending the rights of Irish Catholics, of American colonists, of Indian subjects being plundered by the East India Company. He was not the defender of English aristocratic comfort. He was something harder to categorize. A defender of actual particular people whose actual particular lives were structured by actual particular institutions. Family, church, guild, local community. That abstract philosophical systems never bothered to look at before dismantling. What Price was celebrating, Burke saw as something else entirely. When you ground rights in pure abstraction, in the logical proposition that all men are equal, you have done something that sounds generous and is in fact deeply dangerous. You have untethered rights from the institutions that make them exercisable. You have given people a philosophical formula and taken away the social architecture that gives the formula any meaning. Burke's phrase is the direct answer to Price's abstraction. Yes, all men are equal in the partnership, equal in standing, equal in dignity, equal in their claim to justice. But the partnership is not a philosophical proposition. It is a living structure, with history, with memory, with debts running in both directions across time. And within that structure, what each person is owed is not a mathematically equal slice of everything, but a fair portion, proportional to what they contribute and shaped by the full complexity of what contribution actually means. That word, contribution, is where this video's argument turns. Let's stay with the history for a moment, because it is not abstract. Burke predicted in 1790 that the French Revolution's project of grounding political life in pure abstract rights, severed from tradition and institution, would produce not liberty, but catastrophe. He was mocked for it. Price's followers thought he was a reactionary, a defender of kings, an enemy of progress. 3 years later, the Reign of Terror began. Between 1793 and 1794, the revolutionary government that had proclaimed the rights of man sent between 16,000 and 40,000 people to their deaths. The guillotine ran in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The king was gone. The church was suppressed. The old institutions were dismantled. What replaced them was not a free people. It was a vacuum, and into the vacuum rushed the most ruthless available power. Burke didn't predict this because he was a prophet. He predicted it because he understood the mechanism. When you remove the institutions that form the character a free people needs, the family, the church, the local community, the guild, you do not produce freer individuals. You produce people with no compass, and a state that rushes in to fill the space they leave, always with worse results than the small circles it replaced. The terror was not an accident. It was the logical destination of a philosophy that thought abstract rights were sufficient to hold civilization together without the social scaffolding of inherited institutions. That is the historical proof. And it runs in a straight line from Burke's argument about equal rights to the disaster his argument was designed to prevent. But here is where this video's argument gets harder and more honest than anything you're likely to hear on either side of the current debate. Most conservative uses of Burke's phrase treat proportion as a code word for meritocracy. You earn what you get. The market prices contribution accurately. Differential outcomes are the natural result of differential effort and talent, and any attempt to equalize them is an assault on justice. That is the standard deployment. Burke would not recognize that argument as his. His proportion was calibrated to contribution to the common good of the partnership, not to the price the market assigns to a particular skill at a particular moment. And the partnership for Burke was not a marketplace. It was a compact between the living, the dead, and those yet to be born. It included debts that ran backward in time and obligations that ran forward into futures no one could yet see. Think about what that means for what gets counted as contribution. The farmer who raised 4 children, to be honest, who buried neighbors in hard winters, who held a rural community together across 2 generations. Burke's framework counts that. The salary attached to it is almost nothing. The contribution to the partnership is enormous. The woman who held her church's prayer chain together for 40 years, who sat with the dying, who remembered the names of people whose own children had forgotten them. Burke's framework counts that too. No market prices it. The partnership depends on it. The grandfather who passed on a trade, a set of manners, a way of reading the Bible, a vocabulary for right and wrong. The grandfather whose influence runs through a family for 3 generations after his death. Burke would say this man made one of the most significant contributions to the partnership imaginable. His proportion is not 0 because no employer cut him a check for it. This is not a small correction to the conservative reflex. It is a reorganization of the entire argument. Burke's distinction between equal rights and equal things is not a defense of whoever the market happens to favor. It is a defense of the full range of human contribution, including the moral, the familial, the civic, the communal, against any single metric that reduces the partnership to a number, which means it cuts left and right. It refuses the equal outcomes logic of the progressive framework, which would make every differential outcome evidence of injustice, but it also refuses the market outcomes logic of certain strains of conservatism, which would make the market's verdict the last word on who contributed what. Burke was more demanding than both. This is why the phrase keeps failing as a rhetorical weapon and succeeding as a philosophical argument. When you deploy it as a weapon, equal rights, not equal outcomes, debate settled, the other person has a point. You sound like you're defending a system that ignores the farmer, dismisses the pastor, and prices only what a corporation can monetize. They're not wrong to hear it that way, because that's often what the phrase is being used to mean. But when you deploy it as Burke meant it, as a defense of the full thickness of human contribution, against any abstraction that would flatten it to a single metric, the argument becomes something else entirely. It becomes a case for the institutions that make contribution possible, the family that forms character, the church that provides a moral vocabulary, the local community that holds memory across generations. These are the institutions that the equal outcomes logic, taken seriously, eventually has to attack, because they produce differential outcomes. The family with a father who reads to his children every night produces children who read better. The church community that cultivates patience and delayed gratification produces members who are more reliable. The neighborhood where people know each other's names produces lower crime and higher trust. All of these are unequal by the metric of outcomes. All of them are, in Burke's framework, essential contributions to the partnership. This is the argument you've been trying to make. You felt it. You couldn't find the sentence. Burke wrote it in 1790. Now, there's a gap between having an argument in your head and being able to use it in a real conversation at a dinner table with someone you love who sees the world very differently. That gap is real, and it doesn't close by itself. If you want to go deeper, not just understand the distinction Burke made, but practice carrying it in your own voice in the specific conversations that matter to you. There's a workbook in the link in the description. It's called What Your Instincts Already Knew, and it's built around 8 exercises that take you from felt conviction to grounded argument. Not Burke's argument as an abstract thing, but your argument about your family, your faith, your community, your particular life. The link is in the description, and it's also pinned in the first comment. So where does this leave us? The phrase is real. Burke wrote it. The full argument is more powerful than the soundbite version, and it is also, I want to be honest with you here, more demanding of the people who use it. Because if the partnership includes moral, familial, and civic contribution, then the people who want to defend differential outcomes have to be prepared to ask whether those contributions are actually being honored, whether the family is being supported in the formation work it exists to do, whether the church retains the authority to speak a moral vocabulary that the culture still recognizes, whether the local community is intact enough to hold memory across generations. Burke was Irish. He knew what it looked like when those institutions were hollowed out by a power that neither saw nor valued them. He spent his career defending them, not in the abstract, but in the specific. These Irish Catholics, these American colonists, these Indian subjects whose names the East India Company could not be bothered to learn. His conservatism was not a defense of whoever happened to be winning. It was a defense of the particular against the abstract, of the living against the formula, of the partnership against the theory. The phrase he left us is not a finishing move. It is a standard. And standards require something of the people who hold them. The question that remains, and it's worth sitting with, is not whether Burke was right about the distinction. He was. The question is whether the institutions that make his argument coherent are still intact enough to carry it forward. That's not a question for Burke. That's a question for the living partners in the compact, which means it's yours. Tell me this. What's the one contribution you've made or watched someone in your family make that no market would ever price, but that you know held something together that would have come apart without it? Leave it in the comments. I want to know what the partnership actually looked like in your corner of it.